Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You had a very exhaustive set of lectures, and we don't seem to giving you a respite from this. But hopefully, these are the last two of the series, and you will be able to take this much more tolerance. Um, Retinal vascular occlusions are an important topic from the point of view of a retina specialist, and basics of that are expected from virtually every ophthalmologist. So I think you come into that category. The vascular occlusions can be arterial or venous. Now, among the arterial occlusions also, you could start all the way from the ophthalmic artery. You could have ophthalmic artery occlusions, you can have central retinal occlusion, you can have the branch retinal artery occlusion, and you can have a cilioretinal artery occlusion. When you come to venous occlusions, you could have a branch retinal vein occlusion, and this could be either a major vein or a macular vein, or what's also known as a tributary vein occlusion. You can have central retinal vein occlusions, which can be ischemic or non-ischemic, and then you can have hemispheric BRVOs, which are hemispheric retinal vein occlusions, which are considered a form of BRVO by some, and others consider it a form of CRVO also. Now, what really is the pathophysiology of this? What's happening? Actually, what is happening is a concatenation of factors. It's not one factor alone. Whichever the vessel, something is causing a narrowing of the diameter of that lumen, and that can be from various causes. Now, that causes turbulence and slowing of the vascular flow, and along with that, you're getting damage to the endothelium. Now, you know, when the endothelium gets damaged, what happens? Platelet aggregation starts, and finally inflammatory factors start, and finally you get a thrombus formation there. This is aided further by a situation where the blood flow is slower. So the slower the blood flow, the more likelihood of such a thing happening. So if there's hyperviscosity for any cause, this will increase it. So things like even polycythemia, macroglobulinemia, all those things can cause. So you have whatever you can think in your mind about things which cause hyperviscosity are going to be predisposing factors for this to happen. And finally, if there is a hypercoagulable state, and for that you can have either acquired factors or congenital factors which are responsible. In arterial occlusions, you know, you're talking about something which has a very high flow, so something which has to block that high velocity flow. That high velocity flow can either be blocked if there is an embolus that happens, suddenly blocks it, or something that causes a thrombus to very quickly form in that area. So what are the common causes that we see? And of course, once in a while it can happen because of a very severe spasm of the artery also. So what are the causes of this? You can have carotid atherosclerosis, you could have carotid valvular disease, which lets a thrombus form, an embolus form, or you could have thrombi formed following an MI, which go ahead and throw emboli. You could have lipid emboli in patients with pancreatitis or even Pusch's retinopathy. Trauma is, that's why, an important cause. Rarely a retrobulbar injection can cause a arterial occlusion. And of course, coagulopathies, any congenital or acquired ones, will predispose to it. When it comes to venous occlusions, now this is precipitated by narrowing of the diameter of the lumen. In a CRVO, it happens proximal to the lamina cribrosa. In BRVO, it occurs at the AV crossing. At the AV crossing, if the artery is above the vein, it presses on it. The artery being harder, and the harder the artery, the more the arteriosclerosis, the more it will happen, chance of that happening. And along with that, now there is a consequent damage to the endothelium, again aggravated by hyperviscosity, hypercoagulable state. All those things will further aggravate the situation. Now, if it's a very severe venous block, then obviously the ischemia will also occur. But if it is a less severe block, it's mainly an increase in the hydrostatic pressure. And what does it do? It causes more and more fluid to leak into the tissues, into the extracellular space. So you get permeability changes. The importance, now you say, well, so what? I mean, it must be a rare thing. It's not. It's fairly common. In fact, vascular occlusions are among the second most common retinal vascular diseases globally. And that's why it's important. As far as prevalence is concerned, the most common vascular disorder that you'll see a block you will see is a BRVO. The next is CRVO. Rarer than that is CRAO, and BRAO is rarer than a CRAO. Okay, so that's the kind of frequencies you're talking about. So how does, we'll start with CRAO and then go ahead to the venous blocks. So how does a central retinal artery occlusion present to you? The patient comes with a history that is a very sudden loss of vision. Occasionally he may give a history of amaurosis fugax, but that vision loss is sudden within a few seconds, and he says suddenly dikhna band ho gaya. When you do the anterior segment examination at that time, the anterior segment may look normal, but an almost immediate development of a afferent pupillary defect will be there. So if there is a patient who comes to you and says, I can't see, and you see an afferent pupillary defect, suspect something like this has happened, something which is grave. In the early phase, and this is very important, because what happens is patient goes to the casualty, you are the CMO there, you look at the fundus and theek hi to lag raha hai. There isn't any cherry red spot within the first few hours. In the first few hours, the fundus looks normal, but if you look carefully at the blood vessels, you will see what is known as boxcar movement, or we also call it cattle trucking. You know, the columns of blood seem to be moving back and forth, depending on the severity of the block. So this is the only sign you will have in the absence of that cherry red spot, and that is the only way you can make the diagnosis. But what will be there? This, along with the fact the vision will have been reduced to something like counting fingers, and the patient has a relative afferent pupillary defect. These three things will help you to make your diagnosis. Now, why does this cherry red spot occur? Now, what you can see what it looks like. This is what it looks like. It's a little more brown than red, so it's but that is what this cherry red spot looks like. This is because in the fovea, the retina is thinned out, you know that. So you can visualize the underlying RPE and choroid, but surrounding it, what is happening? Wherever the nerve fiber layer starts, that is getting opacified. The inner retina is getting opacified, and that opacification causes the whitening. So this is the whitening. This is the area where you can see the underlying structure. So you get this picture. Now, some patients get saved because of a cilioretinal artery. You know, in 10% of patients, the cilioretinal artery is giving the supply to the foveola, and if that happens, a patient with a CRAO may get away unscathed. But now you see over here, what you see here is actually a cilioretinal artery block. You see that? The entire area of the cilioretinal artery, which is the papillomacular bundle, is involved. The fovea is relatively spared, and this fellow still is roaming around with 6/6 vision. The emboli as a cause are around 20%, but there's one variant called the Hollenhorst plaque, which is glistening yellow cholesterol emboli, which can be asymptomatic also. The patient may not get as severe a block, it may be a partial block. The other important thing you must understand is a CRAO is not just an eye problem. Somebody has a CRAO, now this guy has a higher mortality also. So he must be investigated. Is there any other predisposing factor which is causing this? The other important thing, which I think which people don't realize, we used to first think rubiosis iritis doesn't occur very commonly after CRAO, but the fact is, we used to think it's 1 to 5%. The fact is, the figure is now believed to be around 20% and develops 4 to 5 weeks after the event. So it's very important to look for rubiosis in your patients of CRAO also. On fluorescein angiography, what you would see? You'd see delay in the arterial filling, you see, but more important than that, if you want to see how badly the CRAO is affecting the patient, look at the delay in retinal arteriovenous transit time. This is normally less than 11 seconds, and this is the time between the appearance of the dye in the artery and its appearance in the vein, which is now correspondingly filled completely. That is what is known as arteriovenous transit time. If it is more than 11 seconds, it means the block is still persisting, even though the dye is coming into the retinal arterioles. very rarely you have a complete lack of arterial filling. The other important thing, now if you have a patient whose vision is PL positive, PL positive is not the kind of vision you see in CRO. If you see something like PL positive or hand movement vision, and the patient on a fluorescein angiography also shows marked prolongation of the choroidal filling, normally it should be 5 seconds or less, it should fill in that much time. But if you have a cherry red spot and the choroidal filling is also prolonged, think in terms of an ophthalmic artery occlusion. It's not a pure retinal artery occlusion. Any such patient needs to have a complete systematic workup, an ESR to screen for giant retinal arteritis, which is more common in the West. An ocular treatment is given if the patient presents up to 24 hours after the occurrence of the disease. We know that any block of up to 90 minutes can be reversed, but still, so we know that there may be some possibility of recovery up to 24 hours, but more than that it usually doesn't help. So if your patient comes with a history of less than 24 hours, it's still worth doing all these things. The easiest to do is an ocular massage. And how do you do that? Repeatedly press the eye for 10 to 15 seconds, then release it suddenly. So, bringing the pressure up to 60 millimeters and then taking it down seems to help in bringing moving the embolus into a smaller vessel and helps to open it. The other important thing is anterior chamber paracentesis. Now the other things which have been tried are a vitrectomy for displacement. You do vitrectomy and bring the pressure low, hoping that maybe the embolus will dislodge. And of course, hyperbaric oxygen is another thing which is being tried. These are things which can be tried, but the fact is that the prognosis is fairly bad. Few patients may get good vision, usually they do not. As I said, you need to evaluate for neovascularization of the iris and do a PRP if required, and that is all you can actually do effectively. At least you can try to save the eye. Vision, we don't know how many, most patients will not get, but many of the patients can recover if you are treating them on time. The treatment does not seem to change the natural course very significantly, but some difference is there. Let's now come to branched retinal occlusions. Branched retinal vein occlusions are something you're going to see very carefully, very commonly. And the important thing here is, see, you are going to see this and you're going to be treating this. Now you must know, when I treat this, am I making a difference to this patient? If there is no difference between what you are doing and what the natural course is, there's no point treating the patient. So what is the natural course? The natural course is that spontaneous recovery occurs in more than 2/3 of the patients, and occurred in 2/3 of the patients in the BRVO study. Final visual acuity greater than 6/9 in half the patients. However, there was one review which gave a fairly bleak kind of response, but the general picture is that this is a fairly mild disease and you can get fairly good vision in these patients. So what is the problem? The basic problem is persistent macular edema, which occurs in 5 to 15% of patients, and development of neovascularization. So what you see over here, let's see what happens. If your vision at presentation is better than 618, more than 75% will remain stable or improved. So that's fairly good. If patients have a vision of less than 621, then the degree of improvement goes down. Again, the median time to, even if you don't do anything, it is going to resolve in more than 50% of cases. It takes around 21 months, around 2 years for a major BRVO and 18 months for a macular BRVO. But the important message here is, if the initial visual acuity is less than 621, so you have 624 vision, be more aggressive. You need to treat this. The other important thing is, what happens to the vision in terms of the patients who present with, say, 612 vision? They improve to 6/7.5 in 6 to 15 months, and that's the median visual acuity. The important thing is, how many patients would go bad if you don't treat them? So if you see how many patients will get a vision of less than 660 if they are untreated? If it was a macular BRVO, that's around 10%. If the initial vision was better than 618. So better vision, there's a small chance of going into this. Worse vision, 20% chance. The same is for major BRVOs also. So if you have better than 618 vision, the chance of your deteriorating is also less, and the chance of your improving is anyway good. So therefore, you don't need to be very, very aggressive in your treatment, and we'll come to that later on. How do you investigate your vascular occlusions? If you have a young patient getting this kind of disease or even a CRVO, you need to investigate, rule out congenital or acquired hypercoagulability syndromes. As far as ocular treatment, ocular tests are concerned, OCT is the mainstay. Fluorescein angiography and OCT angio may become important in the future. A fluorescein angiography is done usually after the hemorrhages have cleared up. You don't do it in the beginning itself. Now let's see, and finally you want to do it for seeing the adequacy of laser. If you have a patient with very good vision, better than 6/9, good near vision, be conservative. If the vision goes down, you need to use anti-VEGF agents. If the patient has come to you within his first month, if the presentation is after the first month and there are marked increase in retinal thickness, then you need to give intravitreal anti-VEGF agents. So let's see some cases. This is a patient who had good vision, mild and 15 days duration of symptoms. We looked at him. We know half of these patients will improve on their own. We just kept under close observation. The vision improved to 6.6 over the next 6 weeks, and nothing was done. And now we know that anti-VEGF agents work, and that was shown by the Bravo and Cruz trial. The SHORE study showed that even if you give PRN injections individualized, it works. Then why did we not give in this? Because there's reason to believe that we weren't losing anything. The BRVO study and the Bravo study said that, look, if you wait 6 months and then start the anti-VEGF agents, these patients don't do well. However, if you look carefully, if you see this graph, what do you see? You realize that if there's a delay of up to 2 months also in initiating treatment, there is no, you see this? This is up to 60 days delay. There is no change in the visual results. So all we said was delay for 4 weeks. The patient's improving, leave him alone. But yes, here is another patient who was deteriorating. Vision was 612. Treated and he resolved. Here, how much will you give? You keep on giving injections till he becomes okay. And then if you have total resolution, you do conservative treatment. If you don't have resolution, you give the anti-VEGF agents. If you don't get a response to 3 consecutive injections, give him steroids. To show you that, this was a patient who had multiple injections, no response, got an Ozurdex and finally responded to treatment. And you can see that this kind of, once you get a response, now you have to keep the patient under follow-up. There are patients who don't respond, and that is something like 20 to 25% of patients with anti-VEGF agents. That is why laser also has a role, especially in BRVO. What did we see? That in BRVO, patients who could heal were more, 21% healed with laser alone as compared to 13% with only anti-VEGF agents. So that is why, remember, lasers have an important role in treatment in BRVO. So you have a patient, you give ranibizumab, he gets a recurrence, this time do a quadrantic laser if there are more than 5 disc areas of CNP. He gets another recurrence after that. This time you can again give the injection, but this time you give him a modified C-grid laser, which also helps to bring down the edema. And if you still get recurrences, you may have to consider steroids. So this is just to show you a patient who was started on this treatment, responded to treatment, got recurrence, was treated when he got the recurrence with laser. First a scatter laser was done, became okay for some time, again got the recurrence, this time treated with a grid, again followed up with anti-VEGF agents, and finally he responded. So the important thing is that judicious use of anti-VEGF agents and laser can help to decrease the number of injections, and bring a better conclusion in patients with BRVO. This is not for CRVO, okay? Now, so if you are following your patients and you decide the patient's not is getting recurrence again and again, now check, is it possible that he may not deteriorate too much? So if you see the deterioration is less than 1 line, manage conservatively. If it is more than 2 lines, treat this patient with a treat and extend regime. So this is to show you a patient whom we were giving injections every month after month. And then I decided it's too much. What are we gaining? So we said, let's see what happens if we stop. We stopped, and believe me, nothing happened. The patient stayed just at the same level of vision. So we were unnecessarily treating this. So don't be over aggressive. If you find that the patient's needing injections again and again, and the gain is only say a line, you can stop and see. If you stop, do you still need more injections, or does he stay there? There is that fear of a constant loss is unwarranted. There is also, this slide is actually to show you that basically that what we said about lasers helping, you see in patients who have chronic disease, if you give them a combination of laser and anti-VEGF agents, the results are better. This is what the results are like compared to if you treat them with monotherapy. So that is why it's good if we combine these 2 therapies to get the best results. I think I'm just quickly going to rewind this. This sums up, you start with anti-VEGF agents, go to intravitreal steroids if you're not getting a response, use lasers as already advised. Basically both steroids and anti-VEGF agents work, but anti-VEGF agents are safer, and that is why we prefer to start with anti-VEGF agents, and both ranibizumab and aflibercept work as well. CRVO, the important thing for you is this is a more severe disease. More than 30% of patients with non-ischemic CRVO will convert to ischemic CRVO within 3 years. So then all patients of CRVO need regular follow-up. And in ischemic CRVO, the risk is of developing neovascular glaucoma in more than 25% of patients. This is the kind of picture you would get in ischemic CRVO with lots of hemorrhages, a lot of extensive capillary non-perfusion on FA. But the most important thing is a relative afferent pupillary defect and a ERG B by A ratio reversal tell you that you're now dealing with ischemic CRVO. Most of the times, vision-wise, their vision is less than 660. This is the difference between ischemic and non-ischemic. Now, you have a patient. We know that for CRVO also, anti-VEGF agents work, and here the response to anti-VEGF agents is better than response to conservative treatment, and this is there both with aflibercept and with ranibizumab. And you can see over here, gave an injection, became all right, got a recurrence. This is the basic characteristic. They come back, gave the injection again, and now finally it did not get any more recurrences. Here we have a patient who has one eye which is a venous stasis retinopathy, other eye which is a ischemic CRVO, huge amount of edema. And this, the non-ischemic one also started developing edema, and then finally treated with anti-VEGF agents. You can see the edema from here came down, but the other eye also was treated, and here you can see on the fluorescein angiography how much is the CNP area. This entire area is completely ischemic. The entire macula is gone, and that is what an ischemic CRVO looks like. Finally, with repeated treatments and an ischemic CRVO with laser, you can help to cause a resolution of the treatment. It's very important when you get the same picture of a non-ischemic CRVO in a younger adult, you must rule out inherited hypercoagulability states, that is a protein C, protein S, factor V laden, homocystinemia, acquired hypercoagulability states like antiphospholipid syndrome, SLE, myeloproliferative disorders, and vasculitides. These are all to be ruled out. The mainstay of treatment is anti-VEGF agents. Scatter laser can be used if you're getting multiple recurrences, even in a CRVO for the periphery, and in ischemic CRVO, it definitely has a role. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, vascular occlusions have problems. They need multiple injections. We don't know when to stop, especially with CRVO. But with treatment, with regular treatment, we can treat most of them. You can be more aggressive. You have to be more aggressive for CRVO. You can afford to be less aggressive in a BRVO. Management is a work in progress, but there's cause for optimism. We can save many of these eyes, and not only save the eyes, but save vision in many of these eyes with proper monitoring and treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was really a lucid one. But for